Hello and welcome back to my channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. It's not normal to get in trouble with your partner. And yet, on Sister Women, that expression has been tossed around so casually for times that it slightly raises an eyebrow presently, which might actually be the most unsettling part of all. Because when grown-ups in a marriage start talking like nervous children staying outside the star's office, commodity deeper is easily broken. And nowhere has that dynamic been more visible than in Kody Brown's connections with his women. Particularly as the family unraveled in real time on camera, revealing a power imbalance that suckers can no longer ignore. Where emotional blessing, affection, and indeed introductory respect feel to be handed out conditionally depending on who's carrying and who's allegedly stepping out of line. And while early seasons of Sister Women tried to frame this dynamic as part of the structure of plural marriage rules, prospects, harmony, the after seasons ripped the curtain back to show commodity far less philosophical and far more controlling, because healthy marriages, plural or not, do operate on fear of discipline, emotional pullout, or the constant anxiety of disturbing one dominant mate. Yet time and time again, women like Janelle, Christine, and indeed Meri have described altering their just, silencing their requirements, or worming around exchanges specifically to avoid Kody's wrathfulness, disapprobation, or cold shoulder. Which raises an uncomfortable question that suckers have started asking further loudly in recent times. When did responsibility turn into control? And when did cooperation turn into exploration? The expression getting in trouble suggests an authority figure and inferior, not two equals navigating life together. And when Kody himself has openly conceded that women who differ with him, challenge him, or fail to prioritize in the way he expects will face consequences, whether that's reduced time, emotional distance, or outright rejection, it stops being a quirky turn of expression and starts sounding like a warning marker. Because in a healthy relationship, disagreement is ant defiance and expressing frustration is ant rebellion. Yet on Sister Women, those lines have been blurred to the point where dissent is framed as treason and independence is treated like a trouble, particularly when it comes from women who are no longer willing to emulate their emotional well-being just to keep the peace. And Christine's departure from the marriage was arguably the clearest rejection of this entire system, because she didn't just leave Kody. She left the idea that love should feel like walking on eggshells, that commitment should bear swallowing your voice, or that being a good woman means no way making your mate uncomfortable. And the fact that her exit was met not with tone, reflection, but with wrathfulness, blame, and allegations of disloyalty only corroborated what observers had been seeing for times. That Kody's interpretation of marriage revolves around obedience rather than collaboration, and formerly Christine refused to play by those rules. The vision shattered, transferring shockwaves through the rest of the family, especially Janelle, who for times had flattered herself on being low conservation and independent, only to ultimately admit that indeed she felt the strain of constantly negotiating her worth within a system where blessing could be abandoned at any moment. And when Janelle began pushing back emotionally, financially, spiritually, it came clear that the trouble wasn't about bad just at each, but about women refusing to deform themselves into shapes that no longer fit. And Meri's experience maybe illustrates this most sorrowfully, because for times she remained fairly disassociated, emotionally insulated, and intimately lowered, yet still spoke as though any attempt to assert her needs might land her father in trouble, which is heartbreaking when you consider that marriage is supposed to be a place of safety, not surveillance. And when Robyn entered the family, the dynamic shifted indeed further, because suddenly there appeared to be a woman who infrequently sounded to be in trouble, whose emotional requirements were prioritized, whose grievances were validated, and whose relationship with Cody was framed as further biddable, more pious, more regardful, which inadvertently stressed the implied rules of the system. Fall in line, support the primogenitor, and you'll be awarded. Challenge him, and you'll pay the price. And while Robin herself has frequently claimed she wants peace and concity, the imbalance has fueled resentment, not because she asked for special treatment, but because the structure itself allows one man's emotional preferences to mandate the well-being of multiple women. And that's where the conception of getting in trouble becomes deeply disquing, because it normalizes the idea that love must be earned through submission. That harmony comes from silence, and that conflict is a moral failure rather than a natural part of mortal connections and suckers watching from the outside. Numerous of whom have been in unhealthy connections themselves have decreasingly honored these red flags, pointing out that when a partner fears consequences for expressing discomfort, that's not admire, that's exertion. And when the show began, Sister Women deposited itself as indispensable family structures. But as the seasons progressed, it unintentionally became a case study in how power imbalances erode closeness. Because the women didn't leave simply because they were unhappy. They left because they realized that unhappiness had come to birth, and that being constantly hysterical of doing commodity wrong was no way to live, let alone raise children who internalize those same dynamics. And that generational impact cannot be ignored. Because kiddies who grow up watching their maters apologize for having passions, shrink themselves to avoid conflict, or accept emotional neglect as normal, are far more likely to replicate those patterns in their own connections, which makes Christine's decision to leave not just stalwart, but defensive, a protestation that love shouldn't feel like discipline. And Janelle's eventual separation further underlined that consummation, especially as she began articulating her desire for collective respect, emotional safety, and autonomy, effects that should be standard, not revolutionary. And indeed, now, as Cody continues to express confusion over why his marriage has failed, he frequently frames the problem as defiance, lack of fidelity, or reluctance to misbehave with his prospects. Infrequently admitting that hookups erected on fear of reprisal are unnaturally unstable. And the irony is that by averring on control, he lost the very family consanity he claimed to value most. Because love cannot thrive under constant trouble, and respect cannot be constrained. And as Family Women moves forward with fractured connections, readdressed individualities, and women rebuilding lives on their own terms. What makes the idea of getting in trouble with a partner especially disturbing on Sister Women is how regularized it came, not just within the family, but within the narrative of the show itself. Because for times, observers were subtly counseled to see Cody's emotional responses as justified, consequences rather than red flags, his pull out of affection as leadership rather than discipline, and his wrathfulness as a response to discourteousness rather than a turn down to tolerate. Autonomy in that architecture matters because when a relationship is presented as commodity that requires constant behavioral correction, it conditions everyone involved, including the followership, to accept control as care, which is why so numerous suckers now look back on earlier seasons with a sense of apprehension, realizing that moments formerly brushed off as Cody being Cody were actually early warning signs of a system that placed one person's emotional comfort above everyone. Additional cerebral safety. And the women learned over time exactly where the unnoticeable lines were drawn, which motifs would spark pressure, which needs be dismissed, and which feelings were considered inferior. And that kind of emotional mapping is exhausting, because it forces people to live in a constant state of tone monitoring, always asking themselves whether speaking actually is worth the fallout, whether asserting a boundary will affect in distance, and whether staying silent is the safer option. And when silence becomes survival, the relationship has formally crossed into unhealthy home. Indeed, if no bone wants to say it out loud. And what's striking is how frequently the women themselves internalize the blame, describing conflicts not as dissensions between equals, but as particular failures to meet prospects, which is exactly how power imbalances sustain themselves. Because when one mate becomes the judge, jury, and emotional doorkeeper, the other mates start policing themselves, doing the controlling work for him. And that dynamic was especially apparent whenever Cody spoke about respect, a word he used constantly, but defined hardly, nearly simply as compliance with his worldview, his opinions, and his authority, leaving little room for collective respect that acknowledges differing perspectives, emotional requirements, or live justs. And when respect is demanded rather than demonstrated, it stops being a value and starts being an armament, one that can be applied widely to award fidelity and disciplined dissent. And this picky enforcement is why the expression getting in trouble carries so important weight, because it implies that love and access are tentative commodity that can be abandoned if rules are broken. And in adult connections, especially marriages, tentative affection is one of the clearest pointers of emotional manipulation. Indeed, when it's unintentional, because it teaches people that they must earn introductory kindness, tolerance, and attention rather than awaiting them as a birth. And the long-term impact of that assignment is ruinous, eroding tone worth and creating a feedback circle where individualities feel decreasingly responsible for the emotional state of the person in power, which is commodity observers saw play out constantly as the women apologized for Cody's moods, excused his absences, and reframed their own pain as particular failings. And maybe nowhere was this more visible than during moments of extremity when empathy should have been automatic, but rather came transactional, offered only when just aligned with prospects, and withheld when it did end. Transferring the clear communication that vulnerability was respectable only when it didn't challenge the scale. And that kind of emotional terrain does and just damage marriages. It reshapes individualities because over time, people stop asking what they need and start asking what will keep the peace. And peace achieved through fear is peace at each. Its repression in the unraveling of the Brown family was unforeseen or shocking to those paying close attention. It was the ineluctable outgrowth of a structure that prioritized control over connection. And when Christine eventually articulated that she did and feels safe emotionally, not unsafe in a dramatic sense, but unsafe to be honest, unsafe to be completely herself, it reverberated within numerous observers who honored that feeling incontinently, because emotional unsafety frequently goes unnamed, dismissed as overreaction or perceptivity. Indeed, though, it's one of the most sharp forces in any relationship. And the fact that her honesty was met with guard rather than compassion only verified what she formerly knew, that the system had no room for her growth, her boundaries, or her evolving sense of tone. And Janelle's trip followed analogous bow, slower and quieter. But no less important as she gradually moved from accommodation to assertion, realizing that independence without respect is still confinement, and that being easygoing doesn't cover you from being devaluated when the rules shift. And Mary's prolonged limbo maybe stands as the most painful illustration of what happens when someone stays too long in a dynamic where stopgap is suspended, but no way fulfilled, where conciliation is inferred, but no way formed, and where the fear of doing commodity wrong outweighs the possibility of doing commodity right for oneself. And the tragedy isn't just that these women suffered. It's that suffering was framed as spiritual growth, as immolation, as substantiation of commitment, which makes leaving feel like failure rather than emancipation. And that narrative is incredibly hard to forget, especially for women raised in belief systems that emphasize abidance over joy and obedience over fulfillment. And as the family fractured, Cody frequently spoke about treason, fidelity, and responsibility, but infrequently about empathy, form, or responsibility for the emotional climate he created, which suggests an abecedarian misreading of what cooperation actually requires. Because leadership in a family is about control, it's about care, and authority without responsibility is simply dominance. And the collapse of the Brown marriages forces observers to defy an uncomfortable verity that systems erected on scale and deed, when framed as consensual or faith-grounded, are incredibly vulnerable to abuse. When one person's passions come law, and disagreement becomes defiance, and the women departures didn't destroy the family, they exposed the cracks that had always been there. Cracks widened by times of emotional imbalance, unmet requirements, and the normalization of fear, grounded compliance. And in that sense, family women has evolved into commodity far more poignant than its generators likely intended. Getting a glass for a numerous observers reassessing their own connections, fading expressions like walking on eggshells, keeping the peace, and not wanting to get in trouble as advising signs rather than tricks. And that artistic shift matters because it challenges long-held hypotheticals about immolation abidance and what love is supposed to feel like, reminding people that healthy connections are quiet. Another subcast that makes the idea of getting in trouble with a partner so deeply unsettling on family women is how language itself became a tool of normalization. Because words shape reality. And when grown-ups constantly describe their marriages using correctional language, it subtly rewires prospects about what love is supposed to look like. And over time, observers were just watching unhealthy dynamics unfold. They were being introduced to a vocabulary that framed imbalance as structure, submission as maturity, and emotional pullout as consequence rather than atrocity. And this matters because language doesn't just reflect power. It reinforces it, especially when one person's emotional responses mandate the emotional climate of an entire family. And Cody's tendency to speak in absolutes, fidelity, obedience, respect created in terrain where nuance faded, where complex feelings were smoothed into right or wrong justice, and where women learned snappily that there was veritably little room to be mortal without risking relational fallout. And when emotional expression becomes parlous, authenticity becomes a liability, and authenticity is the foundation of closeness. Meaning, the marriages were still hollowing out long before any sanctioned separation passed. And one of the most meaning aspects of this dynamic is how frequently Cody framed his wrathfulness as commodity caused by the women. Rather than commodity, he demanded to manage himself because responsibility was personified, shifted onto the women for making him feel disrespected, unheard, or challenged, which again glasses a parent-child dynamic rather than adult cooperation. And when someone believes their emotional state is another person's responsibility, discipline becomes justified in their mind because consequences feel earned, not assessed. And this is precisely how emotionally coercive systems sustain themselves without ever demanding overt pitfalls. Because the fear is internalized. And the women begin anticipating responses before they indeed do, editing themselves preemptively, abandoning requirements before they're raised, and calling it compromise, when in reality it's tone. Abandonment. And the tragedy of this pattern is that it frequently masquerades as peace, because smaller arguments are visible on the face. But underneath that calm is a constant churn of anxiety, resentment, and grief for the tone that no way gets to completely live. And over the times, suckers could see this wear and tear on the women's faces. Hear it in their voices. Notice it in the way they dithered before answering questions. always calculating how honest they could go to be, and that vacillation is a reflective sign of emotional unsafety indeed, if no bone. Names it as similar. And when Christine eventually named it, when she admitted that she no longer wanted a marriage where love felt tentative, it shattered the vision, not just for her, but for the followership. Because once you see the pattern, you see and unsee it. And suddenly, moments from earlier seasons take on a different meaning. Moments that formerly sounded like petty dissensions or personality clashes now read as early enforcement of scale, as training moments where boundaries were pushed and resistance was discouraged, and the women. Differing responses to this system highlight how people acclimatize in different ways to control, with Christine ultimately rejecting it outright, Janelle trying to negotiate space within it, Mary adhering to the stopgap that compliance might restore favor, and Robin appearing to thrive within it, whether designedly or not, because she sounded to understand the rules intimately and operate comfortably inside them, which does make her a villain so much as it makes her a glass. Reflecting back exactly how the system rewards alignment with power. And that's an uncomfortable verity for observers, because it forces the consummation that the problem isn't one bad person, but a structure that elevates one voice above all others. And when that structure goes unquestioned, indeed well, meaning individualities can come complicit in its detriment. And the longer the system persists, the harder it becomes to strike. Because by also, individualities are wrapped around it. Belief systems justify it, and leaving feels like moral failure rather than tone preservation, which is why the women exits were so destabilizing to Cody, because they didn't just reject him, they rejected the premise that his authority was irrefutable, and authority without concurrence is control no. Matter how it's framed, and the show's elaboration unintentionally maps this unraveling in a way that's rare on reality TV. Because observers were presented with an unforeseen reproach or explosive treason, but with a slow corrosion of emotional trust, the kind that happens still incrementally until one day someone realizes they're more hysterical of staying than leaving. And that consummation doesn't come fluently, especially for women mingled to prioritize family harmony above particular fulfillment, and raised to believe that abstinence is a virtue and discomfort is evidence of commitment. And when those beliefs collide with lived experience, when times of trouble fail to produce safety, closeness, or collective care, commodity has to give. And for the brown women, what gave was the silence. Because once silence breaks, the system can no longer pretend to be functional. And Cody's response to that breaking silence was telling, because rather